And with that, we are live. So my name is Jesse. I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. And if you're joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And classrooms are back. It is so exciting to have kids in classrooms across North America and around the world. We know it's a really strange year for all of you, so we so appreciate you continuing to tune in live on YouTube, Facebook, and more to catch some of the coolest explorers and scientists and organizations from around the world. So today's presentation is special for a number of reasons. We'll get to all of those in a minute, but I wanted to start off by saying that today is a joint presentation. So I said I'm from Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, and I also want to bring in Tim from Reach the World. So Reach the World is an organization we have done, I think, 30 plus broadcasts with, partnered with over the last few years. Amazing explorers, some of the coolest people we have ever brought in for our sessions. So I wanted to give Tim the chance to highlight a little bit about what Reach the World is all about before we dive in with our speaker today. So thank you so much for joining us, Tim.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Jesse. It's good to be here with you. I'm really excited to do this special crossover event between two of my favorite scientific organizations, Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants and the MOSAIC expedition. Like Jesse said, this is a crossover event. Reach the World does our Explorer program. We do virtual exchange expeditions with a number of expeditions, and two of our current expeditions are the MOSAIC expedition to the Central Arctic and Jessie's BackyardBio expedition. And those two are going to cross over today. I'm really excited to see what we discover about a new backyard up in a place where it's going to be kind of surprising to hear what lives there. Thanks for having me, Jesse.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Tim. Well, let's bring in Jessie Creamean. So she has joined us before on a live direct broadcast highlighting a really cool experience on board the MOSAIC expedition. So I'll bring that up again, both the MOSAIC's main page and the Reach the World page. It is the largest Arctic expedition in history, featuring some of the coolest scientists from across the globe in one of the most remote, inhospitable, and beautiful environments on Earth. So Jessie has the job we all wish we had. And today she's going to share a little bit about her own experience and about some of the cool, amazing animals that are up there. So with BackyardBio, it is all about the fact that wherever you're joining from around the world, you can find amazing wildlife near you. And that is true. If in your own backyard, in your basement, there's cool spiders, there's all sorts of stuff. But we have to admit that the Arctic is one of the most amazing and coolest, literally and figuratively, places to check out wildlife. So Jessie, thank you so much for joining us today, and can't wait to hear what you have to share with us.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessie. So can you guys can see my screen? We're good to go?
We are good to go. Let's do it.
All right. So as Jessie had mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the animals that call the Central Arctic their home. So basically the animals that we were exposed to during the MOSAIC expedition. And so my name, also Jessie, but I'm an atmospheric scientist from Colorado. So I work at Colorado State University, and I've been in Colorado since late 2012. Now, to get to this point in time, I had to get 3 degrees in chemistry from my college degree in Illinois, and then I got 2 degrees in California in chemistry. And one thing about me, and it's a little bit odd, is that I love doing research in cold places. So I like lots of snow, lots of ice. I've been to the Arctic Ocean a number of times. And I've also worked at the top of the Swiss Alps. So if it's cold, bring it on. And I love going there. And I also research certain things in these locations. So my research looks at how tiny microscopic particles in the air interact with clouds. And I'll go into a little bit about that in a moment. And so for MOSAIC specifically, I was out there doing my research. I was on the first leg of MOSAIC. So I was basically in the high Arctic, living up there for 4 months last fall and into the winter. And one thing that is relevant for this animal talk, and also myself, is that I absolutely love animals, and especially my dogs, Montana and Whiskey, who are pictured here, but also laying on the couch listening in as well. And so MOSAIC, this is the multidisciplinary drifting observatory for the study of Arctic climate. And basically what this is a year-long expedition where people are living and doing science on this icebreaker. So shown up here on the left, that icebreaker basically sailed up to the Central Arctic, got frozen into the ice on purpose, and there's all sorts of measurements going on the ship and also at different stations on the ice around the ship. And so some of these pictures are just kind of showing you what life is like as a scientist on an icebreaker during MOSAIC. So you're living on a ship, you get transported by helicopters, you have to work in really dark and cold conditions with lights just on your head. And then we also have to wear these ridiculously thick clothing so that we can stay protected from the really cold temperatures and the blowing snow. And so the big point of MOSAIC is to understand Arctic climate. And so there's all these different processes that are happening in the Arctic that researchers like myself are up there focusing on. And so you can see that there's things happening in the deep ocean that certain scientists are studying. There's sea ice scientists up there understanding what's happening in the sea ice. And then there's a bunch of atmospheric scientists up there like myself that are looking at all the different things happening in the atmosphere. And so today we're going to focus on the ecosystem part of that and looking at the animals that live and thrive up in the Arctic. Now, some of you might be thinking, but Jessie, you're an atmospheric scientist. Why would you be talking about animals? Well, I'm not a biologist or an ecologist by training, but what I research has a lot to do with the ecosystem up there. And so the ecosystem is full of all these little organisms that live in the water and the ice. And these things are producing different gases and different materials that can then make their way into the atmosphere. Now, these things can have different chemical reactions in the atmosphere, and they can actually help form particles in the atmosphere. And so these particles have a big impact on clouds. And so if you think of a cloud like a tree, it needs these particles to grow on and form. And so that's what my research is, and that's how it links to the ecosystem. And so there's all kinds of different animals that are living up in the backyard of Polarstern and of the high Arctic in general. And so they're all really part of a very complex ecosystem and food web. So this schematic is just giving you kind of an idea of what you might find up in the high Arctic. So we have really, really tiny little microorganisms like bacteria. We have a little bit larger microorganisms like sea ice algae. We have things like copepods, which are basically small, tiny little shrimp that you can barely see with the naked eye. There are things like polar cod, seals, and then on the land and the ice, we have mammals like Arctic foxes and also, of course, polar bears. So we're going to step through these different animals and what we see during MOSAIC, either under a microscope or with the naked eye. The first being these marine bacteria. And so basically what these things are really tiny single-celled microorganisms that are at the very base of the food web in the Arctic. And so these pictures up here on the right of the blue and red, those are basically tiny little bacteria that are fluoresced with special dyes under a microscope so scientists can count them, look at their shapes and sizes, and kind of see how they move around. And so the shapes of bacteria are pretty simple, honestly. They can be these blobs, they can be rods. Sometimes they have these little tails called flagella so they can move around, but they basically look like these general shapes and sizes. Now, the ocean is cool because the oceans all over the world contain 2,000 to 3,000 species of bacteria. So it's quite a bit of these tiny little blobs floating around. So as indicated, they live in the seawater. But what's unique about the high Arctic, where we were for MOSAIC, is that they can live in the sea ice in these things called brine channels. Basically what those are, you can think of, there's tiny little tunnels in the sea ice that are filled with salty water. And that's where these things like to live. But there are also bacteria found in the snow that falls on the sea ice as well. And they're often associated with where algae live in the ice and in the water. Now, bacteria are pretty small, but they do have to eat. So they recycle nutrients from things like waste from phytoplankton and fish. So when phytoplankton and fish produce waste or they die off and decay, they turn into organic matter that these bacteria then eat. And bacteria are actually very important for cloud formation. So a lot of my research in the past has focused on looking at Arctic waters and how these bacteria can come from deep waters of the ocean up to the surface and into the atmosphere where they can affect clouds. And that's part of my research for MOSAIC, is looking at that over the full year in the high Arctic. Now looking at some other microorganisms called sea ice algae. So these are plant-like microorganisms that are also at the base of the food web, but they're a little bit different than bacteria. They're basically a type of phytoplankton, like the plankton you see in the open ocean, but instead they live in the sea ice. And they're called plant-like microorganisms because they need sunlight to live and grow, so they produce chlorophyll. So these pictures here are showing some images of sea ice communities. So these green filament looking things, those are thousands to millions of sea ice algal cells that live in communities right under the ice. And so often what happens when scientists like myself are coring for ice in the Arctic for samples, you see these layers of brown within the sea ice cores like you can see here in that picture. And that's indicating that's where a bunch of those sea ice algae were living together. Looking at this right picture here, that's where you can see a microscopic image of sea ice algae. So you can see they're kind of odd shapes and sizes again, kind of like bacteria, but perhaps a little larger. Now there are over 1,000 different types of species in the sea ice alone. So there's a lot of these guys living up there. So specifically in the sea ice, they like to live in those ice brine channels, so those really salty little tunnels in the sea ice, but they also like to live in the bottom of the sea ice, especially in the summer and the spring when there's sunlight coming through the ice. They need that to grow kind of like a plant that you would see on land. And that's when you see these filaments of sea ice and these blobs of algae that are under the sea ice is when we have the sunlight in the spring and summer, basically when they bloom, kind of like trees do and flowers do on land. And so these things eat nutrients that are made of nitrates, phosphates, and sulfur, different compositions of chemicals that are found that they feed off of. And some of them, because they're plants, also eat CO2 and produce oxygen. And so these things are also important for cloud formation because the materials that they produce in the oceans can also become airborne and then can affect how clouds form. All right, now we're getting to things that you can actually see with the naked eye. So copepods. Basically what these are very small multicellular crustaceans. So they're kind of like shrimp and they're called swimmers. So this picture here in the black with all the little critters that look like shrimp, those are all different types of copepods that you can see in the Arctic. And basically what happens for MOSAIC is we capture these things with these giant nets that we send into holes that we chainsaw into the deep ocean so we can collect these things. And so the bottom image here is showing some jars full of different copepod species that are separated into what they look like. And so scientists like my friends who are ecologists on the boat can actually count them and look how their numbers change over the time period of the annual cycle. So these things are really fascinating because they're tiny and you can just barely see them with your eye, but they can swim up to 295 feet per hour, which if you think about it is pretty impressive for something the size of your very end of your pinky nail. So these things kind of live all over the ocean, but it depends on the type of year where you might find large numbers of them. So this image up here on the right is kind of showing how they change where they live throughout the year. And so oftentimes you'll find these copepods near the sea floor when it's dark in the wintertime. So you think of it kind of like they're hibernating. And as the sun comes out during the middle of the year when we have more, say, phytoplankton and algal blooms, they like to kind of go up to the surface waters and soak in that sun. But what's interesting is that they also can live in the sea ice. So they'll find little pockets and brine channels and kind of get lodged in there where they can live during certain times of the year, even in the winter during that. So these things, they actually eat other organisms. So they will eat the bacteria, they'll eat phytoplankton, they'll eat the ice algae that we've talked about, and they'll eat other decaying matter from larger animals as well. So these little things, again, impressive little creatures, they can eat almost 400,000 phytoplankton in one day. So they stay pretty thin, but they got to swim quite a bit to work off all that food that they're consuming. All right, so now getting into an animal that you guys might be more familiar with, a polar cod. So basically, this is a type of fish that's specially adapted to the Arctic. Now, if you think of a polar cod like a car, it needs antifreeze in its liquids to keep it from freezing. So what happens is these fish produce special types of antifreeze proteins that go throughout their blood so that they don't freeze their blood when they're swimming around in the really frigid Arctic waters. So these things can be found all over, kind of similar to copepods. They're in open waters, they're on nearshore waters, they're in deep and shallow waters. They can reside at river mouths where nutrients from the land come in and feed them. And they can also live inside the sea ice. And this is specifically where we saw them for MOSAIC with underwater cameras, where they can hide from predators, but also they can eat the food that comes with the ecosystem in the sea ice. And so just to give you an idea of these things, they can swim down to 3,000 feet into the Arctic Ocean. So it's pretty impressive the temperatures that they can endure. So they eat a little bit of larger organisms like zooplankton. They eat marine worms, krill, shrimp, and other smaller cod themselves. So they have quite a diverse diet. All right, now getting to the mammals that we have seen during Polarstern's expedition during MOSAIC. So one particular type of seal that we see, which is the most common in the Arctic, is called the ring seal. And so their name is really special because it comes from their characteristic design they have on their back. So you look at the bottom picture here, that's an adult ring seal, and you can see all the spots with the light circles around them. And so that's where they get the ring seal name. They start off a little different. So if you look at this middle picture, that's a ring seal pup on the sea ice, and you can see that they're all white to kind of blend in with their environment. But as they get older, they develop their fur coats that they have that unique design on. And when they're adults, they can weigh up to 150 pounds. So these things get pretty big. Now their habitat, they live in any ice-covered sea where they can find fish, but also hide from polar bears. So they need to be able to access open water, but they also need to be on land because they can't constantly be swimming. Although they are very good, efficient swimmers, almost better than copepods, I'd say. And so their diet consists of cod, like the polar cod we just talked about, other types of fish in the winter. But then remember, those copepods and other crustaceans like to come up to the shores and the surface waters near the summer. And so that's kind of what they predominantly eat in the summer along with the fish. And that's a specifically fun treat for the seal pups from what scientists have found. All right, now jumping to a different type of mammal, an Arctic fox. So these things don't really swim too often, as you could probably imagine. They're very small foxes that are native to the Arctic. But what's unique about these foxes is they're kind of like a chameleon. So they'll change their color with their surroundings or depending on the type of season. So for example, you see this middle picture here with the darker foxes. Those are some baby foxes on the tundra during the summer. And so they're brown to match their environment. But what we saw specifically during MOSAIC were these Arctic foxes in white here. So you can see all these other three foxes. They want to blend in with the snow surface. So they change color to adapt to that. So these types of foxes can live on the tundra, and that's where they're most likely brown, especially during the summer, or they can live on the sea ice and even up near the sea ice near the North Pole, which is where we saw them during MOSAIC. Now their diet consists of small mammals like voles, seal pups, fish, and seabirds. And then specifically on land, like the ones that are living in the tundra, they eat things like berries, insects, and then along the coast, they can eat also seaweed. So one other interesting tidbit about these mischievous animals is they not only eat other animals, but they like to chew on cables and scientific equipment. So we have to watch out when we're doing science up in the high Arctic because these sneaky little creatures can come up and bite a cable without knowing, and we'll just find the damage later on. All right, so on to the last and probably most recognizable Arctic animal that we see during MOSAIC, the polar bear. So of course, these are the very, very large bears, but they're unique in that they have very thick fur and fat layers to keep them warm in those temperatures that reach 50 below zero. Now, another interesting thing about these types of animals is they have unique paws to help them adapt to living on the sea ice. So first, they have really large front web paws, and basically they are able to act like paddles so they can swim into the waters to capture their food. So this middle picture here is showing two different polar bears. One, this little guy, he's about to jump into the water, so he's going to make use of those paddles. And this other polar bear is just walking around on the ice. And so when you think about you walking around on the ice, it's not that easy. You can easily slip and fall. And so polar bears have all these little bumps on the pads of their paws, so they have really good traction on the ice. And so that's how they're able to live on the ice, but also be really efficient swimmers and stay warm in those kind of conditions. So these polar bears, interestingly, even though they are called polar bears, they only live in the Arctic. So you will not find polar bears down in the Antarctic, in the South Pole. So in the North Pole, in the Arctic Circle, they live where the sea ice mostly meets the water because that's where they're going to find the food, similar to the ring seals. So this map in the upper right-hand corner is just showing different regions, tracking polar bear populations. And you can see that along the coasts of North America, especially, you can see these big dark circles, and those are basically indicating that's where a lot of the polar bears are living, and that's where they're being counted. But if you go to the white regions, like in the smack dab middle of the Arctic Circle, basically where MOSAIC took place for most of the year, there's that big open circle. And what that means is that we don't know how many polar bears live up there. So it's really unknown how many of them actually live up in the Central Arctic, even though during the expedition, there's been a number of different polar bears that have walked through our camp. So what these things eat, ringed and bearded seals, and these bears are notorious for playing with scientific equipment on the ice and chewing cables. So you can see that in a picture down here taken from MOSAIC, and that happened pretty often throughout the expedition. So all these different animals that we've talked about, they range from the teeny tiny bacteria to sea ice algae. We've talked about copepods. We've talked about fish, seals, Arctic foxes, and polar bears. So although these animals are very different in size, they're different in what they're made of, they're different in what they eat, they all have a lot in common. You know, they depend on each other for food. But one big linking element about these animals is that they really depend on the Arctic sea ice for their food, their shelter, and their transportation. So the animals we talked about were specifically the ones that we saw during MOSAIC in the high Arctic, but there are other animals that are a part of this whole complicated ecosystem, like birds and other types of swimming creatures and other types of microorganisms. And so all these are linked together, and all of them depend on the sea ice. And so in a rapidly warming Arctic, the sea ice is melting really, really fast and changing the homes and food sources of these animals. And so scientists like myself, you know, we're trying to understand the Arctic climate and processes happening there, but we're also evaluating how these processes and changes are affecting the animals up there. And so with that, I'm going to throw up a bunch of cool pictures from the expedition from when I was there. And I really want to highlight this website. So this is from the University of Colorado, their Series Research, Education, and Outreach team. And so if you want to find out more information about these animals that were spotted during MOSAIC, you can go there. And there's also a lot of really cool resources at this website that you can find about the expedition itself, the science going on behind it, and also, of course, the animals. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jessie. And if you want to kill your screen share, that's good. And then you can see us again.
All right.
We have a bit of a conversation. That's awesome. That was great. You covered so much in like 20 minutes. Boy, I know. You know what? While we're getting ready for questions, for all our groups joining on YouTube or Facebook, let me know where you're joining from. I know we got a class in Oregon, and that's really exciting. Haven't had an Oregon group in a while. So just let me know where you're joining from. Share your questions there, and we'll take as many as we can. And get Tim back in to highlight a few of the Reach the World questions that have been showcased on their expedition over the last few months. But I wanted to start off with one about your polar bears. So a lot of people know polar bears, not an animal you necessarily want to run into on the ice. We have the footage of them right from the ship. When scientists go out onto the ice from MOSAIC, is there something in place to prevent polar bears running into them? How do they go about that?
So we have a lot of safety protocols in place, not just for the scientists on the ice, but also for the bears themselves. So we have people at the top of the ship that have the windows that overlook the entire ice camp. They're people up there constantly watching through binoculars, through infrared cameras, looking for animals that might be polar bears off in the distance. And this is difficult in the dark, but that's why we have so many people keeping an eye on it. And so we have people looking up from the bridge, and then we also have people on the ice that are called polar bear guards. And so even scientists like myself, we had to, help out with the responsibility of guarding for polar bears. So instead of doing science on the ice, sometimes you would have to volunteer to watch the horizon and see if you can see anything that might be a polar bear. And so we've only had a few encounters with polar bears where they were spotted off in the distance. And what happens is we have a safety protocol in place where the scientists will have to go seek shelter. There's a leader of each group, and then they either make it back to the ship or they go into the huts that are on the ice. And so we have a lot of different ways to protect ourselves from polar bears. So we've not had, knock on wood, too close of an encounter. But it's also to protect the bears too. We don't want to have them come up to a human and encounter a human or encounter something that they might not be used to. Kind of like you don't want to feed chipmunks at a national park. It's kind of the same thing with polar bears. We don't want to disturb them as much as possible. So yes, definitely a lot of safety measures we have to take into account.
I love the stakes in the fact that they just get scientists to become like the polar bear watchers, because it's like the ultimate job that you cannot do wrong. Like there's no way to train someone for that. You never had that experience, and if you do it wrong, it go very poorly. We'll leave that one alone on the side. People poured in with comments on YouTube. Send questions. We'd love to have some questions. Don't just say how cool it is. Now, by the way, everyone loved your talk as the general consensus on YouTube, but we'd love questions from you guys. Before I head to Tim, one more quick one. So one of the things that we're doing at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants this year is we're really focusing on high school STEM careers. We want to get kids that are in grade 9 to 12 inspired to find out career paths near them. We've started releasing videos that are sort of featurettes along that line. So you highlighted so much of your own career path at the beginning. Is there a favorite part of your job that you get to do? I mean, you highlighted so much. There's something that really gets you out of bed every morning. No pressure.
Everything's amazing. It's kind of strange. You think, oh, she did all this chemistry work, but like I was kind of showed in that schematic, chemistry is a big part of the environment. And so you can take basic fundamental skills that you learn, say in high school and college. And then once you get further along in your education and your career, you can specialize in something related to that topic. So I started doing aerosols and chemistry in aerosols. And then I started becoming interested in how that chemistry affects clouds. And that chemistry is also biology. And so that's kind of how I got to where I was. And so really just find something that you really want to do and you're really fascinated by, and know that down the line, you can target these unique experiences. And so for myself, I love the outdoors. I love cold. And that's why I went into polar sciences, is because I love being outside. I love the cold. And I really have a nice appreciation for our environment and how the climate's changing. And that's why I wanted to go into this field. And so my favorite part is to be able to do something that's my personal passion, but also scientifically interesting to me.
How cool is that? And I love that you highlighted that, you had the passion to begin with of working in cold places, of doing this sort of work, and then the science followed. And I think that that's something that we highlight for Arctic expeditions, for space, for deep sea things. You don't need to be a top scientist. If you want to be a top scientist, fantastic. You can be like Jessie and just kill it and find an amazing thing for the world, change the world, save the world. But if you like cooking and you want to be a cook, the ship Pullstern needs cooks. They need people that are going to go on the expedition and blog about it and take pictures and tell those stories. And so there's so many roles available to you, no matter what you're interested in, if you want to end up in a certain sort of situation in your life. So don't let that get in your way. And I think that's a really powerful message. So thank you so much. I'm going to bring in Tim. So Tim, come on back in. Let's get your mic demuted. You're good to go. So if you want to share a question on behalf of Reach the World students, go for it.
Yeah, I'd love to. Jessie, thanks so much for speaking about the animals of MOSAIC and the things you found in the backyard of Polar Stern. We have a lot of student questions about that over the course of the past year that we've been connecting with MOSAIC, and I'm just going to share a couple questions from our students. One of the big ones is that students want to know if there's anything you were expecting to see and you didn't see, or anything you weren't expecting to see and did see. I know you were there during one of the coldest, darkest stretches of the expedition, so maybe you weren't expecting to see very much, or maybe you were. I'm curious to see if anything surprised you.
Yeah, actually, so I expected to see polar bears, but I was very excited because it was the first time I saw polar bears. Most of the time I've been doing Arctic research, it's been in the summer and on an icebreaker in open water. So that was very exciting to see my first polar bear. What really shocked me was, like you had indicated, it's just such a cold, dark, inhospitable environment. Yet when we were out on the ice collecting ice core samples, or every day I would collect seawater samples, and then every week we would have this special equipment that goes deep into the ocean to collect all sorts of animals and critters living in the depths of the ocean. And it's amazing to me how just so many of these animals live there, and they thrive and they can survive in these really, what you and I would not want to live in, but they live there and they thrive off of it. And it's really, I expected to see these animals there, but I'm just amazed. It still is incredible to me. And I have such a huge respect for them, for how they can live in such a really crazy environment.
Great question, guys. And that's something that we cover so much in so many different disciplines with regards to our explorers that we bring in. It's taken straight from Jurassic Park, but life will find a way. Like, you highlighted all these cool creatures and the comments coming in on YouTube about these wild, weird, unexpected animals. I mean, anywhere you go on this planet, if you crack open a rock in the middle of Antarctica, there will be a lichen inside of it. And that is mind-blowing. In space, you can take water bears, tardigrades, and put them in the outside of the spacecraft, and they can survive that journey in space. There are spiders floating at 40,000 feet on little tendrils of silk. I mean, it's the coolest thing ever. So, so nice to get to highlight such a cool and unique place today. We got a great question coming in from YouTube. So the team from MOSAIC, was this this international crew, were they chosen carefully based upon sort of a diversity of different science disciplines, people that could better work together as a team? How did you end up on this ship as part of this?
So it's definitely a huge interdisciplinary international team. I think there's something like over 700 scientists that are involved at any given time. And so the whole concept of MOSAIC is we wanted to study each part of the system. So the ecosystem, the atmosphere, the sea ice, the ocean. And so the infrastructure for MOSAIC, we knew we needed to have teams with all these specialists and experts involved so that we can address problems and answer scientific questions across disciplines, because everything's all connected up there. And so to be involved with the expedition, we had an idea of who needed to go, what types of scientists, and then to actually be that type of scientist to go on the expedition. There was a lot of planning involved in organizing, and also it's not cheap to be up in the Arctic and doing science up there. So you have to get funding from different institutions like the National Science Foundation, or the Department of Energy funded quite a bit from the US side for MOSAIC. So scientists like myself will write proposals to get grant money to be able to attend these expeditions. Yep. And so it's basically a combination of knowing who needs to be there, but also having the scientists show up with the passion, the interest, and honestly, to have the money to be able to attend such an expedition.
I'm really glad you brought that up. And this is something that we get a lot of from high school students, especially, is like, who pays for all this? And, you know, to launch an expedition like this, to get the scientists up there, to make a vessel like this, all this thing, it's in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's an exorbitant amount of, like, hard to wrap our heads around as sort of normal people. But compared to other elements that governments in Canada and the US around the world spend money on, this is a very, very small portion. I think all of science research in general in the US and Canada is, I think, 0.4 of 1 penny on the dollar. So it's basically nothing, and yet it supports all this knowledge and understanding that we use to make decisions to make the world a better place in so many ways. So I'm really glad you brought it up. Thanks, Jessie.
Yeah, of course.
I'm going to throw a completely different kind of lowball question, softball question to you from a student in Oregon. So here we go. How do Arctic foxes change their fur color in different seasons?
Well, you're about to stump me, because again, I am not a biologist or an ecologist. So it's kind of, there are several animals that change their fur color, fur patterns, and perhaps it has something to do with, you know, dogs shed and they have fur that comes off during certain seasons. So it might be some sort of cycle where their bodies have just adapted to knowing where they are and what season it is, and that they shed that fur coat that they already had and produce the new fur with different colors. So that's the best I can answer it as an atmospheric scientist.
Oh, that's great. And for any kid that's interested, you can look up fur color changes really, really easily. The information you're going to find on even Wikipedia is really accurate. But yeah, they'll lose one coat and get another. And it's literally like we change our clothes in the places like Toronto where we have major seasonal change. You know, we'll wear short sleeve shirts now, and then we'll have big sweaters and thick coats. Same idea with animals. They just shed their coat of fur and grow a new one to be able to facilitate that. So cool question, guys. Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to go back to Tim. Tim, if you have another question on behalf of Reach the World, take us away.
I do. For all the students who've been following you, Jessie, and your colleagues, as Polar Stern has lodged itself in the ice and has done all their work for the past couple months, it's easy. It gets easier to understand the fact that this ship being in the central Arctic is not what animals up there are used to seeing. And I think the underlying question from our students is, what do animals make of you? They're not used to seeing a huge ship in the ice. Are they scared of you? Are they not scared of you? Are they easy to catch, not easy to catch? What's the reaction to having this weird big iron ship in their habitat?
They're definitely not used to it. For example, when we were on our way up there, so it took us about a month to get up there to set up some equipment on the far satellite sites of the ice. And that's when we actually saw quite a few polar bears, because we were going from open water to the ice edge to the pack ice, where, you know, the polar bears were trying to get their food for the winter near the ice edge. So we saw quite a few pairs of polar bears, being a mom and a cub. And what they would do is they would come up to the ships, because I think they could honestly smell the food that was being made by the chefs on board. But they would come up to the ship, they would look around, and of course, all of us scientists and crew on the ship are out there taking pictures and videos and just basking in seeing these incredible animals up close. And they just kind of look at you. And there was one time where the mama bear, they were really close to the ship, like you could look down and see them. And there was one time where the mama bear was kind of, looking a little alarmed and protecting her cub. And they would back away a little bit. So there was a few times that I saw where the mama was trying to protect her young because she wasn't sure what it was. But then most of the time they just kind of walk by the ship, they look up and they're kind of curious about it, but they don't seem too frightened. They will come back. That is actually a big problem if they start coming back and start getting used to it. So that's one thing we don't want to happen. So we try to make sure we don't, bring any food on the ice. We don't have any sort of smelly stuff on the ice. Kind of like when you go camping in the mountains in Colorado or anywhere in the mountain states, you have to hang your food, or, you don't want it to be by you because you don't want them to get used to it. And so same thing happens for polar bears. Like, we can't help it. We have to go up on these giant vessels, but we try to minimize things that might be attractive to them to bring them closer to the ships. And we try to scare them away with things like snow machines. They don't like loud noises from the snow machines or helicopters. So when we have things like that going on the ice, they tend to stay away and they don't really like that stuff.
I love that you dove in with animal behavior, and I love that question. It's something that we almost never get brought up for some reason, and it's one of my, I was actually going to be an ethologist and study animal behavior when I was growing up, so it's amazing to get to hear it with regards to polar bears and with larger animals. And I think that all of us have experienced that maybe with a pet or a deer we've scared in the woods. But one thing we want to stress with Backyard Bio, and we'll highlight more of this in a minute, is that you can see those sort of things just around your house, whether it's a bird on its nest and defending that nest, whether it's a string of ants and you drop a piece of grass in their path and see how they respond to it. You can watch so many cool things happen in the natural world up close, wherever you might be joining from. So check that out, and you'll have hopefully some really exciting experiences like Jessie had up in the Arctic. Fantastic. Let's ask a few more questions before we wrap up. This has been great, Jessie. So Rumesa wants to know, are there any problems you noticed while exploring, or anything new you discovered while exploring? So you can interpret problems however you will, but anything that was a challenge maybe when you were up there, or anything new that you discovered while you were up there?
Oh yeah, well, I'll address the challenge part because that is an easy one. Well, when I was up there, we went from having daylight to complete darkness. And so one of the most challenging things was going out on the ice and having to work in somewhere that it's the darkest dark you've ever seen. I mean, you have lights coming from the ship, but for example, we would have to go collect ice cores farther away from the ship where we didn't really have enough light to work with. So it was really challenging to work with this equipment and drive snow machines through this vast, dark environment. A lot of times it was windy and blowing snow. So it was really challenging to work, not just because of visibility, but also we were working some days it was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And so when you're trying to adjust a screw or dig or do something that you think is a simple task normally, when it's minus 40 out and you have to wear these big, thick gloves, it's really challenging, and you have to have a lot of patience when you're working in the Arctic, because you do encounter challenging conditions that you have to work in that take things a lot longer than you would imagine. Oh, Jessie, you're muted.
There we go. I know what I'm doing. Can you tell? Thank you, Jessie. I just want to say thanks to all the questions coming in on YouTube. They've been great, guys. And a note for everyone, too, this session will live on YouTube. So if you want to share it out, check in later, see any answers you might have missed, it's all going to be there. Reach the World's going to pass it along to it and share it with their community. So we're excited to see many more people check it out. So with that, Jessie, I'm going to turn it to Tim back in a minute to highlight a little bit more about Reach the World's expedition. We'll bring up the banner again so you can highlight. Tim, come on back in. And if you want to highlight for us where people can find out a little bit more about the MOSAIC expedition and Jessie's role in it, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. Reach the World has been working with MOSAIC for several months, really, since the beginning of this year, to highlight stories from several different scientists involved in the expedition. And it's been a really great journey. We're telling sort of an extended story of the expedition through all the different specialties and a lot of different perspectives. And if you want to check it out, Jessie shared the link to the expedition homepage. And I hope you'll join us. We're going to post this video there, and we also have a article from Jessie with some more details about the living thing she saw in Polar Stern, which is the name of the ship's backyard in the Arctic. So yeah, thank you so much, Jessie, for joining us today.
Yeah, excited to talk about animals. It's fun.
Animals are the best. We've had so much fun with Backyard Bio, so I'll bring up the link to that too. So this is my Jessie. There's too many Jessies going on. It's really unusual. It's freaking everybody out. No one knows what's going on. But yeah, Backyard Bio is a program that we're running at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. Reach the World's been pushing this out in a big way for us too, which is amazing. So basically, we're encouraging kids to get out around the world to explore, observe, document, and share the wildlife near them. Hey, if you're in the Arctic and you can get an Arctic fox or a polar bear or a ring seal, please, we'd love to see that. But even if it's a bee in your backyard or a mouse, hopefully not in your house, or moose or whatever you might be able to find, we'd love to see that. Twitter, iNaturalist, a website where you can connect with other classrooms around the globe. Lots of great ways to take part. And I look forward to seeing counterpart Jessie. Oh, there we go. Counterpart Jessie's. I know what I'm doing. Amazing Arctic animals too. So thank you so much for this, everyone. And I really appreciate you all joining us today. So thanks, Jessie. Thanks, Tim, so much.
Yeah, thank you, guys.